Imagine it. The year is 1852. It doesn't matter where you live in the U.S. because everywhere is tense over the subject of slavery. Even before the Declaration of Independence had even been written, this was already a hot button issue. There have been a few key points in the past century that led us closer and closer to what would be the Civil War. The first being the Missouri Compromise of 1820, then the Compromise of 1850, and of course the Fugitive Slave Bill. Then there was one that was said to have laid the groundwork, so much so that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So this is the little lady that started the Great War." That key point was a protest novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Author Harriet Beecher Stowe was born into a well-educated family that was known for being political on topics such as religion, social reform, and civil rights. Stowe was a 40-year-old school teacher who had just moved from Maine to Connecticut when she penned the grueling depictions of life as an enslaved person. The best-selling novel and the second best-selling book, period, of the 1800s revolved around a man, Uncle Tom, who was devoutly religious but also had a very difficult life as an enslaved person. The idea for the story came to her actually during a church service where she had a vision of a dying slave and she felt compelled to tell his story. And this comes sometime after the loss of her 18-month-old son, in which she said, "Having experienced losing someone so close to me, I can sympathize with all the poor, powerless slaves at the unjust auctions. You will always be in my heart, Samuel Charles Stowe." So in March of 1850, Stowe set out to move a nation, and she wrote to the editor of the National Era, which is a weekly publication from the anti-slavery movement. She explained, "I feel now that is the time to come when even a woman or a child who can speak a word for freedom and humanity is bound to speak. I hope every woman who can write will not be silent." Starting in June of 1851, Stowe's stories started coming out weekly and it continued for nearly a year. Originally, they were called The Man That Was a Thing. Then it changed to Life Among the Lowly before it eventually became called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that's when all of the stories came together as one collection set to be published 2 years after the original letter she sent to the publisher. The novel took the tense nation by storm, selling 300,000 copies in the first year. That was absolutely unheard of. But it wasn't just in the United States where the book was a hit. It was all the talk across the pond. So much so that Harriet Beecher Stowe went on a lecture tour in Great Britain. Aside from the success of the book, the main objective of the story was to educate. Most of the Northerners were already anti-slavery, but they didn't really have an idea of what it meant to be a slave in the South, nor what it was like to actually just be in the South in general. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the horror story that they were afraid of. For Southerners, it was supposed to be a wake-up call. They were forcing people into slavery and had been for years, and were more than willing to fight over the ability to continue doing that. Civil rights leader Frederick Douglass promoted the book in his newspaper, but he also published criticism. Perhaps the biggest critic of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel is none other than Martin Delany, who said of her story that she was borrowing and thus profiting from the work of Black writers to compose her novel, and he chastised her for supporting Black colonization to Africa. No matter what side you were on, Uncle Tom's Cabin had your attention, even if that meant you were a Southerner who criticized Stowe for showing emotion over enslaved people, or a Northerner who was so moved by the story that you named your daughter after one of the main characters. In Boston, and the year after the book was written, there were 300 Evas born. Unfortunately, after the Civil War, Uncle Tom's Cabin was sort of twisted in a negative light. And that's because after the war, uh, Uncle Tom took on this negative stereotype for formerly enslaved people. And so, in the years following the war, that's more of what it became. That's more of what Uncle Tom represented for people. But that's really taking it out of context because it was written as a protest in 1852 to the Fugitive Slave Bill and slavery as a whole. And when you don't look at it through that lens, it's really taking it out of context. And it's also important to remember that the inspiration came from real life examples. Josiah Henson was born enslaved on a plantation in Maryland. Eventually, he escaped to Canada and he became successful enough there that he helped other fugitive slaves escape and be successful on their own as well. Phoebe Ann Jacobs was born on a plantation in New Jersey, and she was eventually enslaved by the president of Dartmouth College. She was freed in her later years, but she continued to live with her former owner until she died. The owner died. And then Phoebe went and lived independently and made a living by cleaning clothes of the students at Bowdoin College. And lastly, American Slavery as It Is, a testimony of 1,000 witnesses. This was also used by Stowe in her research when writing the book. And to be fair, Harriet Beecher Stowe also conducted many interviews of her own from slaves who had escaped. Within the first 5 years of publication, Uncle Tom's Cabin had been translated into 20 languages. In 1901, Uncle Tom's Cabin became the first American novel translated into Chinese. Getting out Uncle Tom's story to the masses was such a momentous and important part of Harriet Beecher Stowe's life. So much so that in her final years, while she was battling with dementia, she rewrote the story as if it was the first time she'd ever thought of it, uh, nearly word for word, up until her death in 1896.